Yes, it's win, win, win. It's win for Satellite, it's win for the volunteers, and it's win for the patients and the community as a whole. We are trusting volunteers to bring their unique perspectives, their time and talents to the work that we do. And that increases our capacity not only to help more people, but to have that multiplicity of perspectives.
That's Paula Allen, Satellite Healthcare's volunteer program specialist, who is joined by Emily Watson, Satellite Healthcare's Director of Social Work. It's good to have both of you on NephTalk. Thanks.
Morning. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Christopher.
Can you tell me how the idea for bringing volunteers on board at Satellite Healthcare was initiated and where this program is going?
Satellite, being a nonprofit, is in a unique stance. Leadership at our organization has long been interested in differentiating Satellite from the rest of the crowd in more ways than just our great quality. Looking at how we can serve our patients a little bit more one-on-one is where the idea of having a volunteer corps came from. We spent some time working on it actually last year in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic and realized that we need special knowledge. We were gifted the opportunity to look for someone to bring on board to do that. And that's how we found Paula.
Paula Allen, you have a very interesting biography. You worked for another nonprofit for several years where you had responsibility for 500 to 1,400 volunteers at that organization. My understanding is that you now have 3 volunteers at this point in history. Something tells me that Satellite Healthcare is very interested in ramping up the number of volunteers since you're here. Is that a correct observation or assumption on my part?
That is correct. Anytime you talk about capacity building for nonprofits, you think naturally of bringing on volunteers. How can you increase the number of people you can reach, increase the understanding in a community about your mission, and bring more people in general to the nonprofit work that you want to do? So yes, Satellite is quite interested in increasing our volunteer corps. We've started with our little pilot program and we're moving into phase 2, looking at more locations, bringing on new people, and eventually developing more roles for volunteers with other partners.
First of all, what are people volunteering for and how will you utilize their talents and skills and, of course, dedication?
We are offering the opportunity for volunteers to join us and use their time and talents to help us especially address the impact COVID has had with the dialysis community. So first and foremost, they're screening our patients for COVID symptoms and risk as they come in prior to their dialysis appointments, taking temperatures, asking those standard COVID questions. That means that staff can focus on the uniquely qualified tasks that they have to do with patient care and dialysis.
How do you train volunteers these days? And COVID is still among us.
Volunteers have a series of trainings to go through virtually. So that's all done via computer. We've asked our volunteers and they confirm that they feel well set up to do their jobs based on that virtual training.
Do many of the volunteer candidates see this opportunity as something that might eventually lead to a position with either Satellite Healthcare or in the industry?
Many volunteers come to us interested in learning more about their options in the healthcare world, and they're interested in what dialysis means in the workplace. We interviewed one of our volunteers. She's studying to become a nurse while working full-time in a different industry. And while she understood the role that kidneys play in your body, she didn't understand what dialysis meant for a patient. She didn't understand what an end-stage renal disease diagnosis meant for someone.
How did she find out about this opportunity at Satellite Healthcare?
She knows someone who works at Satellite who has been so complimentary of the culture that we have and the work that we do towards our mission, making life better for those living with kidney disease. As soon as the staff person let her friend know that we were looking for volunteers, she jumped at the chance to join us.
That is probably not uncommon.
Word of mouth is how volunteers join programs. They're looking for a really good experience. They're looking for something where they can make an impact, but they want that to be fun or educational or community building at the same time.
I would imagine that some of your volunteers, they simply want to get to know the company and give back to a group of people who have been friends and relatives of individuals who've experienced perhaps end-stage renal disease or know someone who has, and they see this as an opportunity to address the big picture with their time and talent.
So friends and family are definitely looking for ways to give back. They see the care that we give to our patients and they want to help that situation as well. So we have definitely had interest from friends and family. Dialysis has touched their life and they want to do something towards the larger picture. We're looking in future to having greeters and welcoming duties, getting to know patients better. They'll get to ask, how are you doing today? How can we help you? Who do you need to touch base with today? People can visit satellitehealthcare.com/volunteers. That's our landing page. You can learn more about the options of becoming a volunteer and follow the link to our online application.
Have you heard from people who've expressed interest in becoming a volunteer because they are a caregiver?
We have had people say, what else can I do to help? I've already got a foot in this world. I'm a caretaker. I want to take that next step. I want to do something more. How can I be of service? Either because they've dropped their family member off at the clinic, the center, and they figure instead of leaving and then coming back to pick them up, they could do something while they were waiting. They've set that time aside in their life to be a caretaker. They might as well do more as a volunteer at the same time.
I've spoken with patients who even have, say, high school age kids. How can my kids give back? How can they be a part of this larger organization, give them a sense of this community that helps support their parent? I've had spouses or parents of patients who have asked, how and where can we support? In years past, we've done work with the National Kidney Foundation where we support their walks and bring volunteers to support those events. And hopefully going forward, Satellite can continue to support these kinds of events with our own volunteer corps made up of employees, family members of our employees, or even patients and patients' relatives. So that is a goal of ours. And I know the interest is out there. And it wasn't until we realized there's a specialty here that Paula brings, a knowledge base of how to run a volunteer program that we really needed. And I think now that Paula's in place, we're going to be able to meet a lot of these goals and we're going to be able to utilize the help that's out there.
Paula, you told me that you believe that Satellite is looking at volunteers as a way to create more touch points in the community of people who understand kidney care, and not just end-stage renal disease, but pre-dialysis as well. Now, that's an enormous issue, engaging or perhaps intervening with people on a pre-need basis before they need to commit to dialysis. Can you expand on that idea?
Any pre-dialysis care, any education we can give the community makes the most sense in terms of caring for humanity as a whole. So the more people understand the factors that go into needing dialysis and mitigating those for themselves, the better. In many ways, Satellite would like to address the pre-dialysis needs of the community, provide more education, more outreach. In terms of creating lifelong advocates,
this is really an extraordinary opportunity, which is not necessarily unusual, but sometimes uncommon in medicine, that an individual, let's say a volunteer, gains a large perspective about what a person's life is like with a chronic disease and how that impacts the entire family and their friends as well. Is that a correct perception on my part?
certainly.
And this may be true, Paul, I'd love to hear your perspective, but one of the things about dialysis is most people don't know about dialysis until they need to know. So people don't understand that it's as common, that end-stage renal disease and the need for dialysis is as common as it is until you know somebody or you yourself need to be on dialysis. And once you do, your eyes open to this world that is very intense, very pervasive in the way it affects your life. And yet it is a way to continue living. And it is just such a unique space, but you don't know about it until you need to know about it. And I'm sure Paula had that experience stepping into our world.
I believe that Satellite had all of this in mind when they funded several research studies that had to do with engaging pre-dialysis candidates to not only exercise more, but also to engage in social contact with similar patients. So as they moved forward, perhaps with declining kidney function, which might lead to the need for dialysis, they were better prepared.
I know that Satellite has spent time doing a lot of research with dialysis patients. I know that Satellite is very interested in doing more education and support for pre-dialysis patients to prepare them for the journey ahead and even stave off the need for dialysis. So absolutely, I think the advocacy and the awareness that we can bring by employing a volunteer corps will help that upstream education. Chronic kidney disease is one of those silent diseases. You don't know you have it very often until it's pretty far progressed. And at that point, you start looking at options for care. And so the more education by even bringing in folks from the community to begin that awareness is what we're looking to do, in addition to supporting the patients in our centers.
And Paula, the greater the number of volunteers who understand this, the greater the impact on the larger community. Is that reasonable?
Absolutely, that's reasonable. The quirk of the human brain is we can intellectually understand something, but we can't comprehend it or the emotional impact it might have for someone else until often we meet someone. And it narrows from, yes, this issue affects people, to I know someone, I'm friends with someone who suffers from this condition, right? Or has to go through this treatment. All of a sudden, I have a deeper understanding and a more empathic connection.
Is that consistent with your background in the world of volunteers, that people develop not only a higher level of awareness, but consciousness of what these bigger issues are about, and they can understand what their role is in perhaps resolving those issues or at least dealing with them effectively?
We do research as a field on what motivates volunteers. It turns out that 81% of volunteers say what motivates them to volunteer is understanding the impact of what they do on the lives of people they know in their community.
That must be wonderfully fulfilling.
Your number one job as a volunteer engagement professional is to explain the impact that it's having on real life people and real life problems.
Emily and Paula, and this must be a very exciting time, are in the midst of writing, if you'll pardon the sports analogy, the playbook for Satellite on how to work with a large volunteer cohort as you ramp up and bring more people on board. That's not only very challenging, but it must be very exhilarating.
From my perspective, we took an attempt at harnessing the power of volunteers on our own and found that that was incredibly challenging. And when we decided we really needed somebody like Paula to step in and take the reins, it was a huge relief because not only did she already know what was needed to get going, she was ready to start laying that foundation. And that's what we needed. From my first conversation with Paula, I recognized that she has what we need to get this off the ground.
Satellite Healthcare is a nonprofit healthcare organization. We're dealing with some very serious life and death issues and family members who are very concerned and very sensitive, but perhaps they can also benefit ultimately from the training that you give volunteers and information that is passed on or conveyed in a very appropriate sort of mild intervention volunteer to perhaps a family member or someone who is just experiencing dialysis.
And the research is really interesting when it comes to people interfacing with volunteers. They feel differently about the work and the service a volunteer brings than staff. People trust volunteers to examine whether or not the nonprofit is worthy of putting their time and talents in as a volunteer. So just being able to engage the community as volunteers in your mission means more to your patients than paying staff to do the same work.
Why do you think that's the case? That has something to do with relationships or perhaps the role of the volunteer versus a staff member? Tell me about this.
I think it's because a volunteer's work is indeed voluntary. It's all carrot, no stick, right? So we are bringing volunteers in to work with us to increase our capacity. And to do that, we've had to convince our community, convince our volunteers that our work is worthy and important of giving their time and talents to. A volunteer cannot get more time in their life. You can pay staff more. If you make a donation, you can earn more at work, but you can't get your time back.
Is the motivation different?
The motivation is very much different. And the volunteers who stick with you, who retain, their services with you time after time, are building more trust in your community as they do so, because they still feel like your mission and the way you work towards your mission and the way they can serve is worth their time, the only thing they cannot get back in their lives.
You've said, Paula, that the best volunteer experiences are transformative, not only for the volunteer and person they're engaging, but also, I should think, for the organization.
Mm-hmm.
This will ultimately change the face of satellite healthcare.
Yes, it's win, win, win. It's win for satellite, it's win for the volunteers, and it's win for the patients and the community as a whole. We are trusting volunteers to bring their unique perspectives, their time and talents to the work that we do. And that increases our capacity not only to help more people, but to have that multiplicity of perspectives.
Emily, you said that establishing the volunteer corps was initially an initiative brought to you by leadership. Did they envision a void that could be filled, an opportunity that you're missing? What was the ultimate motivation?
Well, leadership had been mulling around this idea for the last many years and approached me with the idea of looking for somebody to bring on board. The idea stemmed from that model that we're probably all familiar with in the hospitals, lots of volunteer opportunities.
Oh, yes.
And it seemed to translate fairly well until we realized hospital is usually a single site and you manage the volunteers within this single building. And with our dialysis organization, we are spread amongst 80, 85 and growing centers among many different states. To Paula's point earlier, what I think is unique for satellite to do this is that we will be now becoming more than just a medical center in a spot in a community.
I imagine that part of your outreach strategy will be to speak to school groups, community groups, service organizations, after you've had a bit of experience with this, so you can talk about results and outcomes.
Every opportunity is both education and an invitation to serve, explaining the impact that we have and saying, if you're interested in this, if you like the impact we're having, help us double down. Let's double that impact. Let's triple that impact.
It must be really exciting to be here on the ground floor developing a large volunteer organization, but ultimately the beneficiary will be the patient, their family, and the community.
It's very exciting.
I think it's going to be good.
Emily and Paula, thank you so much for joining us today on NephTalk.
Thank you for having us. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Chris.
Paula Allen has been a volunteer engagement professional for 13 years, having earned certificates in volunteer administration and change management, both of which have enabled her to plan volunteer engagement at a higher level.